Oh, here they are, hello, hello. Right, yes, we're here. I'm here to read you my children's book, Little Mr. Poonlop's Seventh Holiday, for children of all ages. So we might as well begin with chapter 1. The cheerily chirping little birds told Mr. Poonlop it was a fine day in early spring. So little Mr. Poonlop got out of his little bed, put on his little dressing gown and went over to his little bedroom window. He opened his little curtains and looked out into his little garden. It was indeed a lovely sunny day. Not very warm, but lovely. Well, quite chilly actually, but at least it wasn't raining. Little Mr. Poonlop said it was all right anyway, and I said he couldn't expect me to write much better weather at this time of year. So, after little Mr. Poonlop had been to his little toilet and washed his little hands, he went down to his little stairs, to his little kitchen, and put his little kettle on. He cut 2 slices of bread from his little loaf and put them under his little grill. Then he opened his little fridge and took out a little bottle of milk. Let's just stop there for a moment. You may have noticed by now that everything in Mr. Poonlop's life is, well, a bit on the small side. I don't know if you're fed up with hearing the word little, but I know Mr. Poonlop is, and I'm certainly tired of writing it, so from now on, just take it for granted that everything in this story is, well, little, until I say it's big. And I promise I won't keep using that word all the time. Okay? Where was I? Oh yes, little Mr. Poonlop was just about to make a nice cup of tea when there was a tap on his front door. In fact, there were 2 taps on his front door. One marked hot and the other marked hot. You see, unfortunately for Mr. Poonlop, when his house was being built, the architects had a rather jolly office party, and at this party some of them had a bit too much to drink and started behaving in a very silly way. They decided it would be great fun to mess around with the plans for Mr. Poonlop's new house. And that was why Mr. Poonlop had to turn on the light switch in his airing cupboard to make his shower run, and why he had 2 hot taps on his front door. Now I've explained all that to you, Mr. Poonlop can go and answer the door because there was also somebody knocking on it. Chapter 2. Mr. Poonlop opened the door and found his friend Sid standing there. Sid was knocking at the door because he had some post for Mr. Poonlop. He had some post for Mr. Poonlop because he was a postman. "Hello, Sid," said Mr. Poonlop. Now, Sid had to knock at the door to give Mr. Poonlop his post because, although Mr. Poonlop's house had 3 letterboxes, 2 of them were on the roof and the other was in the cellar, thanks to those tiddly architects. Mr. Poonlop didn't mind this because it gave him a chance for a chat with his friend whenever there was any post for him. And that was why Sid was so surprised this morning when, straight after saying, "Hello, Sid," to him, Mr. Poonlop added, "Sorry, can't stop." He grabbed the pile of envelopes from Sid's hands and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind him and leaving the poor postman staring at 2 hot taps and a toilet roll holder. Please do not think that Mr. Poonlop is in any way a rude little man. It's very early in the story and I really do want you to like him. He is very nice indeed to everyone he meets and all the little furry animals. Yes, and birds and fish and reptiles. Look, he's nice to everything, all right? He was too nice to complain about all those silly things the builders did to his house, so he's hardly likely to be nasty to his friend the postman, is he? No, I'm afraid it was all my fault. The truth is that Mr. Poonlop had to rush back into the kitchen to rescue his toast from under the grill, where I was writing flames all over it. He had trouble seeing his way to the stove too, because I was also writing lots of steam from the kettle, which had boiled nearly dry. But he managed to turn everything off and blow out the flames. Now, instead of toast, he had 2 pieces of warm charcoal, and there wasn't enough water in the kettle for a cup of tea, so he cut himself 2 more slices of bread, refilled the kettle, and muttered about mean-minded authors who make life difficult just to get a cheap laugh. I think he meant me. With the kettle back on the stove and 2 new slices toasting under the grill, Mr. Poonlop settled down to look at his post. He was quite excited to get so many envelopes. Unfortunately, as he looked through them, he sighed with disappointment. Bill, 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 he said as he looked at most of them. He gathered them together and took them straight round to the house next door. "Here, Bill, these are yours," he said to his neighbour. "It's a good job you're young, because that's a very old joke. I grabbed them off Sid by mistake because oh no!" and with that he ran off home, leaving poor Bill looking very confused. Mr. Poon1 cut 2 more slices of bread, threw 2 more pieces of charcoal in the bin and filled his kettle once again. He opened his back door to let out the smoke and steam, sat on his doorstep and looked at his garden. He looked at the chimney, which was in the middle of the lawn upside down. Now this wasn't just the architect's fault, of course they hadn't helped by instructing the builders to fix the chimney to the roof with cheese spread instead of cement, but you couldn't blame them for the high wind that actually blew it off. It had been embedded in the grass all winter, and this was quite worrying because it meant that every time Mr. Poon1 lit a fire, all the smoke went into the middle of his garden. It's another thing I ought to get fixed this spring, he thought, and he went back into the kitchen to have another go at making his breakfast and reading his Post. Chapter 4. So little Mr. Poon1 got dressed and... What happened to chapter 3? He asked me. Oh, good point, I replied. Sorry about that. Chapter 3. When he went back inside, Mr. Poon1 found that the air had cleared and I had written him a nice pot of tea and 2 slices of golden toast. I'd even written hot melting butter over them. I hadn't opened his letters or read them though, because people prefer to do that for themselves. Most of the envelopes contained junk mail. In fact, due to a slight spelling mistake, one of them contained gunk mail, and poor Mr. Poon1 had to wash his hands after opening it, muttering to himself about stupid authors who ought to get a dictionary. I think he meant me. There was only one real letter, from his Auntie Mildred in Cornwall. The letter asked Mr. Poon1 how he was keeping, told him his auntie was fine, told him the weather in Cornwall was fine, and that Auntie Mildred's dog Wibble had gone missing for 3 days, but had turned up, safe and sound, 4 days later. Then it told him that the weather in Cornwall was fine, asked him how he was keeping, asked how the weather was where he lived, told him that Wibble had gone missing for a week but then turned up the day before, and that his Auntie Mildred was fine. Then on page 9 it told him that his auntie was fine, that the weather where he was fine, asked him how the weather in Wibble was keeping, and told him that his dog, Cornwall, had turned up for 3 days but then gone missing. His Auntie Mildred had always been a bit forgetful. In fact, her name wasn't Auntie Mildred, but she'd forgotten what it was years ago. Mr. Poon1 couldn't remind her either, because he had no idea who she was at all. He didn't mind though, because she'd also enclosed a card and a £10 note for his birthday. In fact, being so forgetful, she'd actually enclosed 5 cards and 4 £10 notes. He couldn't help but smile. It wasn't his birthday. In fact, Auntie Mildred's cards were exactly 1 year late. After reading that, he was about to throw the other mail in the waste bin when he realised that one of the items was a travel brochure. Idly he flicked through its glossy pages, showing exotic locations, sun-kissed beaches and happy, smiling holidaymakers, and he realised that a holiday was just what he needed. Now, before we start chapter 4 again, this might be a good time to explain something about this story. As I'm sure you know, to make books for young people sound more interesting than they ever really are, the titles are always about the biggest, the best, the first, and so on. You know the sort of thing. The Littlest Fairy, Annabelle's First Chicken Sandwich, The Best Bottom in the World, or Jimmy's Longest Worm. So obviously I wanted to call this story Little Mr. Poon1's First Holiday. But then Mr. Poon1 said that was terribly unfair. If this was to be his first holiday, then he must be a very sad little man who'd never had one before. I said that we could just pretend, but he said that if I wrote it was his first holiday, that would be true. In fact, he said that if I called it Little Mr. Poon1's First Holiday, he would refuse to be in the story. That would have made it very difficult for me to write, and even more boring for you to read. So, after a lot of arguing, we agreed that he had been on 6 holidays before, mostly to the seaside, where he'd had a wonderful time, and I could call this story Little Mr. Poon1's 7th Holiday. To be continued. Thank you.